Okay, so as Carolyn said, today's session is going to be on hazards in collections, and then Philippa is going to do a session on mould in collections. So just to introduce myself a bit, my name's Sophia. I'm a preventive conservator for Spencer & Fry. And before that, I worked for HRP, the Science Museum, Imperial War Museum. And so through working at especially the Science Museum and the Imperial War Museum, that's where I kind of got my experience working with hazards in collections. Just to let you know that that's our website and our email address, but also it's you can find Spencer & Fry through the SDMDP website as well, if you want to get in touch for conservation advice. So in my session today, I'm just going to run through kind of an introduction to hazards in collections. So I'll talk about hazard awareness. I'll go through some hazardous materials, but I think it really depends on your collection in terms of what hazards you're looking out for. And then also I'll talk about legislation, and I've got a list of some further information and some specialists who can help you if you've got concerns about hazards. Okay. So I'm just going to move this out the way a bit, maybe. So thinking about what a hazard actually is. So just to say that Spencer & Fry are not hazard specialists, but we can definitely provide you with an introduction and the resources and introduction to the subject and where to go to get further information. But when we're talking about a hazard in collection, really what I'm focusing on here is a material that's got the potential to harm people or other objects. And in this training, really, I'm talking about materials that can potentially harm people. So thinking about where hazards come from, really it's either the material in the object, so it might be something like lead, like the lead token, the lead weight rather, that's in this picture. It might be the way that the materials have deteriorated. So it might be something like a plastic deteriorating that's then releasing cellulose nitrate. Or it could be the way an object's been treated. So things like some archaeological copper was treated with dangerous chemicals, and there's a lot of nasty chemicals that were used as pesticides in the past, so arsenic and that kind of thing. So it can either be material inherent in the object itself, the deterioration of a material that then makes it a hazard, or what's happened to that object in the past. So the images that we've got below, there's the lead token, and obviously the lead is inherently a hazard, but also it depends on the condition of the object and how it's stored. So if it was stored, if it was in poor condition and flaking, that's obviously more of a hazard because it started to deteriorate and your risk of exposure is higher. And that would be the same with the mercury thermometer as well. So there's obviously a small amount of mercury in there, but it's contained in a sealed system, so that's probably quite low risk. But if the thermometer is damaged, there's a higher risk that that hazardous material will come into contact with someone. So then the risk would be higher. Okay, so just thinking about hazard awareness and why it's important. So really, health and safety is the key here, and it's looking after yourself and the colleagues that you work with, thinking about things like the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. Everyone's got a responsibility to look after themselves and others. Also, in terms of legal compliance, you need to make sure that you are working in compliance with the law. There's obviously specific legislation for materials such as asbestos, and there's the legislation linked to COSH as well. And also, it's part of good collections management, really. It's important to know what's in your collection, what condition it is, and that everything is labelled, and you've got it all recorded on your database or in your catalogue system. So obviously the collections management, that links back to spectrum processes. It's also connected to accession and disposal. And also thinking about objects on display that might contain a hazard, because that's obviously risking exposure not only to your colleagues but to visitors as well. So if you're thinking about how to be more hazard aware, it's really focusing on identifying hazards that might be in your collections and also identifying their risk. For example, the image on the top right is a magnetotelephone, and the hazard that we thought might potentially be in there was asbestos fibres in the cable, the cord. So that was something that we were very aware of. So before anyone went anywhere near that object, we had specialist surveyors in who actually came in and sampled it for us, and they found that there was nothing contained in there. So there was no risk there, that was fine. And then in the image on the bottom left, that's a Fijian woven basket. And there was a concern there that that might have been treated with pesticides, but there was no record of it having been treated when we researched it. So we proceeded with caution, wearing PPE to inspect it. And there were no powdery residues found on it. So we just proceeded, we assumed that it had been treated with something and wore appropriate PPE to handle that. So identifying the hazards I'll talk about a bit more, but that really is something that you can work on with curators, and it's just about having knowledge of the objects, really. And ensuring that all your colleagues are aware of hazards and they're aware of the control measures they might need to put in place if an object is hazardous. So that involves things like labelling, updating databases and signage in stores, just so that before anyone picks up an object, they know exactly what hazards are in place, and if there's any extra measures they might need to put in place before handling or using that object. So they may need extra PPE, might need several people, or it might be that there's a suspected hazard, so they need to get some sort of analytical technique carried out to confirm whether or not there's a hazard present. In terms of implementing the control measures, that would be, control measures might be things like PPE, risk assessments and method statements. And obviously you should have risk assessment and method statement for carrying out the hazard assessment itself. So it's really important to be kind of recording, labelling and isolating collections if you suspect there may be a hazard. And isolating might just be as simple as walking away from an object, closing the door, locking it and putting a sign just so that everyone's aware, and no one's going to accidentally stumble across a material that could harm them. I'll talk a bit later about removing and remediating hazardous materials, and that's really about how you manage materials in your collections. So things might include having lead objects treated by a conservator to remove corrosion, and then after that they'd be safe to handle. But really it's ensuring that managing hazards in collections and hazard awareness is kind of a key part of your collections management plan, and that all staff who are working with collections understand that process. So thinking about identifying hazards, I've given you some examples of the actual hazard labels that you will need to use. So once you've identified your hazardous material, you will need to decide what specific hazards are posed by that material. So they'll need to be part of the labelling. But in terms of starting a sort of a hazard survey, we would always advise that you start with a desktop assessment, including an asbestos check, because asbestos, as I'm sure you all know, is found in many, many museum objects. And we would suggest that you work on the principle that everything is hazardous until you can prove that it isn't. It's really important to think about the material, the function and the age of the object. And this is when curatorial input can be really helpful, because they might be able to tell you, if you know your collections, you know, for example, that what period mercury switches were used, or you will know that asbestos was commonly used during this period for this type of collection. So you will already have that awareness. If you have completed your desktop assessment and you're pretty clear that it's not going to contain any hazards, so for example, it might be that it's a silver spoon and that's all it is, you can be pretty confident that it's safe to go and have a look at the object. So we would then recommend that you carry out a visual assessment. And obviously, as I said before, you would need to write a risk assessment for carrying out this process. So if you take a visual assessment, so make sure you have a good look at the object before you handle it. And things like mirrors on extendable sticks can be quite good if you're not quite sure what the object is and you want to see what's behind it. That's really helpful. Then we would say that the next step, if there's a suspected hazard but you're not sure, would be to get either an analytical assessment or measurement. So that could be, for example, monitoring mercury vapor. If you have, we've carried that out for things like really large barometers where they've had lots and lots of mercury in an open system. Or it could be a professional assessment. So that could be by a specialist contractor, like an asbestos survey, or it might be by a specialist conservator who would be able to advise you on the kind of hazards that might be in the collection. But really it's a process of kind of ruling out any hazards. In terms of looking at asbestos, I just wanted to highlight this preliminary asbestos checklist, just because asbestos is so prevalent in museum collections. It's really helpful to kind of assume that something has asbestos unless you can rule it out. And this is a preliminary asbestos checklist from the Museum of London's Hazards in Collections site, and I'll give you the link to this on the slides and in the handout. And it's incredibly helpful because it goes through a series of questions to basically help you narrow down if something is likely to have asbestos in it. And if it isn't, then you can be confident that it's safe to sort of proceed with caution. But if it fails any of these questions, I would say that that would be the point that you want to get a specialist in to come and look at something, because even specialists will probably say they can't tell by looking, they need to sample things. And if you get a contractor who's used to working with museum collections, they can do that sensitively with the guidance of yourself and your colleagues. So the questions they're kind of thinking about is, does the object require thermal insulation to prevent heat escape or protection from fire? So some objects that we found a lot of, obviously things like heaters, but also irons. Often they've got little asbestos gaskets, even model steam engines and that kind of thing. Then thinking about sound insulation, vibration dampening or protection from condensation or filtration. So that's things like anything that needs to be kind of padded out. We've even found it on things like some coffee making machinery from the 50s as condensation protection. High pressure pipework and connections, that's things like, yeah, model steam engines or model beam engines. Any working models, it's good to be thinking about whether it might have asbestos or not. Electrical components, that's quite an obvious one. Resin, felt, vinyl or cement-based products. Friction protection, so things like brake pads in cars, friction pads or conveyor belts, that kind of thing. Textured coatings, so obviously I'm sure you'll be familiar with Artex ceilings, but also on some models and dioramas, they've kind of added a bit of asbestos into the paint to give it a texture. And the other thing is protection from corrosive chemicals, so any scientific collections, and also this is where we would say where the gas mask would fall down as well, because obviously that's a really common place that you find asbestos. Okay, so it's really important to implement hazard awareness in all parts of your working with collections, and that kind of falls under what we've already spoken about, so research, training, communication, so that you're really aware of the type of material and the type of hazard that may present to you, so that you can be confident you've got the right control measures in place. It's important also to think about the level of risk as well as the hazard posed by the material. So you can think about the material, the risk, the hazard that it poses and the risk, and use that for your risk assessment to determine what the appropriate way to move forward is. So it may be that it's really low. For example, it might be that you have a mercury switch, but that might be in good condition, completely sealed off with all the appropriate safety measures. It's not accessible and it's in good condition. That could be really low. Or it may be that you discover that it's actually that the mercury could leak. It might crawl under another surface and be really difficult to retrieve. So then that would be higher risk and you need to take more control measures about that. So if you suspect that there's a hazard in an object, obviously the first thing you need to think about is making it clear to other people that there's a hazard. And so that's thinking about labelling really, what the material is and what the hazard is. So thinking, I've just given you some more examples here. So it might be that you had something like a gas mask, in which case you might be worried that it had, it might be treated with toxic chemicals. It may contain asbestos. So that would obviously, if it's asbestos, that's toxic and it's a carcinogen. It may be that you have a chemical that is explosive. So you need to then label it with the explosive symbol as well. And it's good to have a risk rating. So as I said before, you would then kind of record this on your database, put up any appropriate signage. You might even consider moving it to separate stores. And it's really important to make sure that your risk assessment and your control measures are available to everyone so that no one risks being exposed to any hazards. The example that I've got here is, yeah, mercury contained in a thermometer. If it's in good condition, stored securely in a store with good environmental conditions, it will be quite low risk and easy to manage. Whereas a corroded lead token that is in a cabinet that's frequently opened and poorly controlled will be higher risk. Okay, so again, it's just remembering that specialist curators and conservators are probably the best people to advise on what hazards you might find in your collection, and they should be able to tell you the control measures that should be implemented. As I said before you pick up any object, you need to carry out your hazard assessment, assuming that there is a hazardous material. Checking your database, your catalogues, in case there's information that's already recorded there. Talking to colleagues, they often have lots of knowledge that they can share. And it's having the positive evidence that something is not hazardous before you touch it or allow others to interact with it. And being aware of the other objects next to it, because it may be what you're looking at is fine, but there could be a heater made out of asbestos right next to it, so you don't want to expose yourself to that. And also remembering to check your handling collections as well. So this is just summarising what I've really said about the measures that you should take if you think an object may be hazardous. And that could be as simple as if an object has failed the preliminary asbestos checklist, you can then run through these processes. I've just done a summary of the key points to remember, and I think the main ones are it's really important not to panic and don't feel overwhelmed like you have to deal with anything quickly. Don't rush and don't feel like you have to deal with it on your own. There's lots of people who can help you and advise you on the next step. And there's lots of specialists who will be able to advise you, and we give at the end some resources that you should be able to use to track down people who can help you. Yeah, so just to talk quickly about removal and remediation. It is possible that some objects can be made safe through treatment, by a conservator, or things like removing asbestos. It may be that the object cannot be made safe, so you have to consider disposal, but all these decisions need to be made kind of taking into account health and safety legislation, any material specific legislation, and obviously your own collections management policy, and input from your trustees as well. I've just done a list here of some of the materials that you might find in your collection. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's too many, and really it just depends on the kind of collection you have. And I'm sure you know some materials that might be a specific problem to your collection. But this is just to give you kind of an idea of what you might be looking for. You need to think about really your collection and the risk. Really, I think if you suspect hazards, that's the point at which to seek professional advice. But also, again, it's considering what the material is, what form it's in, what condition the object is in itself, and how you're going to use the object. So obviously, it's a different thing if an object's in a store not being handled very much to something that you might put in a handling collection. So just having a quick think about legislation and compliance. This legislation obviously and health and safety legislation needs to apply to all aspects of your work. So that's particularly important with hazards. Thinking about the asbestos regulations, that also applies to things like labelling and movement, and that's the same with any hazard really. It kind of affects lots of the different processes, so things that go out for loan, exhibition, who's going to look at the objects, and some of this legislation does change, so it's important to be up to date. The Museum of London have got a really good tool that can help you. It goes through everything really clearly, and it lets you know what you need to do and what the museum needs to do as well. There's also things like materials like cellulose nitrate, that's covered under the dangerous substances and explosives regulations. But again, I'd say a good starting point is the Museum of London. And the other thing to bear in mind is that you could potentially be audited by regulators, so it's really important to make sure you're working correctly. The other things I wanted to say is just thinking about this legislation, it also applies to things like how you dispose of any potentially contaminated waste. So that's things like if you're cleaning around the area and you think you may have contaminated waste, or if you've got contractors or conservators working on those objects, they obviously need to be told, and you need to make sure that they can get rid of that waste appropriately. So that's making sure things are double bagged and labelled with their correct hazard labels, and yeah, disposed of correctly. And then this is some sources of further information, some specialists. Again, I would really recommend the Museum of London e-learning tool at the top. The HSE website is also a good place to start. The Collections Trust website is really helpful. And your local council's website can help you with things like understanding how to dispose of your waste correctly. But these are all really helpful resources, and I've also put the Icon Conservation Register there, so you could find a specialist conservator who would be able to advise you on that. Yeah, I think really the starting point is just using your knowledge of the collections to make sure that you can rule out any hazards. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Great, thank you. So we do have one question. It was there was synergy because this question popped up, and then suddenly on your slide you had a child's gas mask pop up. So the question was, we have gas masks in the display cabinets. Should I remove them? We assume they have asbestos in them.
I think I probably wouldn't. I would assume that there is asbestos there, and I think probably the best step would be to have a look at managing asbestos tool on the Museum of London website. That's really helpful. And then I think probably your next step is to get a specialist asbestos contractor in, and they'll tell you, they should be able to tell you the safest way to move forward, I think.
There were no other questions. I had one or two questions. Obviously, is there an insurance issue if you're not handling your collections or managing the hazards properly? Could that have an impact on your insurance?
Yeah, I think it could. Yeah, it depends on the materials and what you've got. But again, I keep going back to it, but that Museum of London thing is really good, and I'll have a look through my notes, and in the handout I can see if I can send you some more information about that.
And I really appreciate it. You also mentioned, don't forget about your handling collections. It's those kind of hidden and often forgotten boxes of stuff in your building that sometimes you neglect to give the same care to. Well, great. If there are any other questions, Sophia's going to be leaving us shortly. So if you do have any questions for Sophia, please put them in the chat. If not, we'll get Philippa to start getting ready to step up and take over the session. Let's see anything in the chat. So Sophia, I think you're, thank you very much for joining us. I know that you've got to run.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we're going to hand over to Philippa just to answer some questions that are in the chat. This session is being filmed. It's videoed. There will be image and sound attached to it, and we will be sending out notes from the session. We're going to just see what the questions are that come up in the chat and try to address those in the notes that follow as well. So I'm going to click off and hand things over to Philippa to continue the event.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Philippa Mapes. A bit of background about myself. Prior to working for Spencer and Fry, I spent about 8 years working for English Heritage as a preventive conservator. And prior to that, I had my own business as a specialist wallpaper conservator. So I've come across quite a bit of mould in my time, less so hazardous hazardous collections, with the exception obviously of arsenic on wallpaper, but mould is the big thing. Which is why I'm going to talk about that today. Talking to people on the weekend. What are you doing on Monday, Philippa? I'm giving a lecture on mould. So there we go. But the reason why we're talking about it today is because it is identified as a hazard. It's one of the most common hazards in our collection that we may come across. And so we're going to focus on it today. I'm going to talk initially about what it is. Then we'll have a look at what it, how and where it grows, why is it damaging, why is it considered a health hazard, how to prevent mould growth, and then how to safely remove it. So it'll be a brief overview, what to look for, how to deal with it. So I'll crack on. Let's start by having a closer look at what mould is and how it operates in our collections. So what is mould? Let me move my bit up. Okay. So mould is a common name that is used to describe a group of fungi that...
Sorry, Philippa,
Yep.
On share screen, I'm just seeing the list of your documents, but not the slides. So
Oh, you're not seeing the slides. Oh, I beg your pardon. Let's have a look.
I think you just have to double click onto the file.
How's that? Is that working?
I still just, all I see is the list of your documents. No, not working. Other people confirm what I'm saying.
Sorry, folks.
We did test this out before.
We did test it out before. Let's have a look. Sorry, everyone, bear with. Let me...
So sometimes it's easier to stop sharing and then restart sharing the screen. So do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just looking for the stop sharing now, which it's rearranged my, here we go. Oh dear, sorry. Oh, I'm going to turn that PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. There we go.
Okay, let me just try it again.
No.
Yep. We're seeing your screen. We're seeing apps, get more done with apps.
Okay. Can you see that, my documents?
No.
Oh dear. No.
Tell you what, I'm going to look. You sent me the PDF of this the other day. So shall I see if I can find it?
Yeah, I'm just trying everything now, Carolyn. I'm really sorry, folks.
That's all right. So why don't we, you just can, if you want to start talking, I'll see if I can find the document and then I'll pop back in with it.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not sure that will work because I've got them on some staggered.
So somebody suggested stop the share, and then when you start, click to share the PowerPoint rather than sharing the whole screen.
So share screen. Or should I click on the PowerPoint?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Share screen. Can you see that?
Yes, now we see it. We've got it.
Oh my gosh.
Right. Thank you very much for your suggestions, everyone.
Thanks, folks. Okay, right, let's have a look at that now. Full screen. If I press that, is it going to, how's that? Can you see it now?
Yeah, we all see it.
Great,
And it's
thank you. Right, right, okay. Dear. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to have a look at what mould is, where does it grow, etc., and how to safely remove it if we have an outbreak. So I'm going to start just by having a closer look at what mould is and how it operates. It's the common name used to describe a group of types of fungi which can grow on the surface of a variety of materials. So it's feeding off dead organic matter, which is why we can often find it growing on organic objects in our museum collection. So textiles, books, leather, etc. Identified as white or coloured furry spots and deposits on the surface of materials. So we can see the clog on the right, that's a leather clog. It's got some white furry mould deposits, and we can see on the right hand side the Petri dish, some examples of coloured mould. So there's some blue ones there. The right hand Petri dish has got a circle of pink mould, and moulds produce these colours as a protection against light, because they're sensitive to light. So these coloured products that they produce also protect them from light. So if we start by taking a look at the life cycle of mould, we can better understand how it's operating in our collections. So if we think of the lifestyle of mould as starting off with a mould spore, and this settles on the surface of our historic objects, which it's looking for as a food source. So that's an item in our collection, our textiles, books, a piece of furniture, etc. And in the right environmental conditions, the spores will germinate and they produce hyphae, which are thin tubular tendrils, and they penetrate into the material that they're on and produce enzymes that break down the material to use as a food source for growth. And as the hyphae grow, they form a network or a colony, which is known as a mycelium. And this mature mycelium then produce more spores, which they send out into the air to colonize other areas and land on other historic objects and surfaces. And these spores are commonly present in the air all the time. They remain dormant, but given the right conditions, the spores will germinate. So, what are the right conditions in which mould will grow? Temperature. Mould requires temperatures to grow within a range of 10 to 35 degrees Celsius. It prefers warmer ranges, the higher levels of this temperature of this temperature scale, but it will function at 10 degrees C. Humidity. Mould requires moisture in the air and on the objects that it is colonizing. A relative humidity over 65% is generally agreed is the point at which mould will begin to grow. So relative humidity in the air will provide enough moisture to sustain that. Still air, so a lack of ventilation. Damp pockets of still air will also encourage mould growth. So you may have seen that slide, bottom right, of the Dover wartime tunnels, the telephonist's office. It's a Spencer and Fry favourite because it rather spectacularly shows what happened in the Dover wartime tunnels, which are underground tunnels in the White Cliffs of Dover, when the ventilation system was switched off over the course of a weekend. So there's a massive big outbreak of mould because there was no air change and no ventilation. But we also need to be aware that whilst the environment of a room in general may be below the recommended 65% RH, pockets of still undisturbed humid air may exist as a damp microclimate in corners, under furniture or behind pictures, as we can see in the top image. Can you see those images, or is that?
Yes,
okay.
we can.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. I'm just double checking now. Okay, so in the top right, you can see the back of an easel painting of which we've got some mould spots that are developing where the picture has been against a cold wall and a damp microclimate has developed there. So as I say, whilst the RH in the room might be okay, there might be undisclosed corners, little pockets of microclimates where there are favourable conditions for mould growth. The fourth factor we're looking for in the development of mould is, of course, a food source, and this is our museum collection. So moulds will colonise a variety of organic materials: paper, leather, textiles, wood, basketry, and organic glues, as well as cardboard storage boxes, for example, that we might have our collections stored in, and also organic waxes, oils and dressings that might have been on the surface of historic objects. But it will also grow on dirt on objects as well. So taking a look at this close-up of the telephonist's desk, we can see there is a greater concentration of mould on the right-hand side where the telephonist rested their hands, excuse me, while they were working. And this obviously has deposited layers of moisture-absorbing dirt, sweat and oils from the skin. And because dirt is hygroscopic, of course, it is holding moisture onto the surface of objects and absorbing moisture in the air. So that is another source of moisture that can allow mould spores to germinate. Another example of this is on the handle of this rowing machine. This is an inorganic synthetic foam handle, so you wouldn't think that was a organic matter that mould might colonise, but there's sufficient dirt, sweat and grease from hands deposited from past use to provide a food source for mould growth when it's stored in damp or undisturbed environment. Mould also prefers an acidic environment, so grease and hand sweat are particularly attractive to it. And because dirt can be moisture absorbing, we can also find mould growing on the surface dirt that is lying on all kinds of museum objects, including inorganic objects such as metals and ceramics, as well as our own plastic storage containers. So the museum object itself might not be a food source, but the layer of dirt and grease that's on it will provide nutrients on which mould can grow and so develop and release further spores. So why is mould damaging and why is it a health hazard? Well, in terms of historic objects, mould will break down the material that it is on to use as a food source. So this can cause permanent physical and chemical weakening of the material. Mould can affect the appearance of an object as the degradation products it produces can stain the material and cause colour changes. So you can see the white furry mould on the leather, the leather strap there, it's particularly attractive to that. Perhaps there's been some extra handling there or some leather dressing, and you can see that there's extensive mould on that which has broken into the surface of the leather. On the right, a paper object which has been stained and weakened. The paper has now been made porous by the action of the hi-fi breaking up its physical structure, produced staining, and thus making it extremely weak on that right-hand side. But also byproducts of mould that are worth mentioning is that it can, because it releases organic acids, it can also etch and corrode metals. So there are lots of ways, lots of objects that will be susceptible to damage by mould. But more importantly, mould is damaging to human health. So as we're talking about hazards today, let's just have a look at the health risks of mould. There is the harmful sign that you need to be aware of for your signage that is particular to mould. We can term mould a health hazard as moulds produce irritant and toxic substances called mycotoxins, and these cause symptoms of ill health or allergic reactions. So typical examples of that would be asthma, hay fever-like symptoms, sneezing, runny nose. And we can also develop rashes and dermatitis from skin contact. In severe cases, neurological problems can develop and can be really quite serious. Mould, both alive and dead, is a respiratory sensitizer. So it causes sensitive reactions in certain people. Again, runny nose, asthma, hay fever-like symptoms. But once you've been exposed to that, and if you are sensitized to mould, it means that each time you are exposed to further doses of mould, your reactions become more and more severe. So you have in effect become hypersensitive to mould. So people with allergies, respiratory problems, compromised immune systems are more susceptible, obviously, and they should not be dealing with mould at all, but everyone should be cautious and ensure that their procedures for dealing with mould are safe. If there is a severe outbreak of mould, as we saw in the slide of the Dover wartime tunnels, it is better to consult a professional company that deals with mould, of which there are many online, Rentokil, etc. A mycologist may also be required to identify mould types in order to provide a targeted response. So identifying particular types of mould, particular strains of mould, and what is the best way to treat them. It's also advisable, obviously, to consult a conservation specialist to deal with the correct cleaning methods for the collection. So Sophia's put some useful notes up there, useful links up there. I've put some at the end, so there will be enough in the combined talk for you to find links to, again, the Museum of London website and also the Conservation Register for specialist conservators. But for the purposes of today, we're talking about dealing with minor outbreaks of mould, and we may find in museum collections. So let's have a look first at the health and safety guidelines. So the legislation that is directly relating to mould in the workplace is the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health Regulations 2002. So that can be found on that link there. As Sophia mentioned, COSH is the law that requires employers to control hazardous substances and put in place measures to prevent or reduce a staff member's exposure to those hazardous substances. So legal compliance is required there. So specific things that we can do to follow this guidance are, firstly, being vigilant to potential outbreaks, so making regular checks of the collection, including behind, around, inside objects, opening drawers of objects, pieces of furniture, etc., and checking objects that are in store and that aren't looked at very often, going into areas of the building that aren't used very often as well to check on those. If we find an occurrence of mould, deciding on a plan of action to prevent harm, and assessing this, and we need to decide on a plan of action to prevent harm and assess the situation by carrying out a risk assessment. So again, as Sophia has outlined, looking at the degree of risk, the extent of the mould, and also including who can carry out the work. So who on the staff is available to carry out the work and who isn't sensitive to mould or has health issues. So, and you may like to add that risk assessment template to your particular procedures to your in your emergency preparedness plan for future reference. So if you have those templates up and ready and running, so if there's a flood and you need to pull those out quickly, who can deal with the issues, where the PPE is kept, what the procedures are, it's useful to have on hand. Of course, making sure that there's adequate training and information in place for those people who have been identified as okay to deal with the outbreak, and also for those who are working in the vicinity of it. So again, there's lots of information on the Government Health and Safety website, lots of toolkits to help you, link at the end of this talk. Make sure your information is up to date as well. So there may be some changes following Brexit, but on the health and safety government website, they are going to mark any changes with EU exit. So it's easy to look and see if there have been any recent changes after that. I don't think they've quite got round to making those changes just yet. So worth looking out for those. And of course, ensuring that you have the correct personal protective equipment available to deal with the problem. So let's just have a quick look at what that might be. Before touching any mouldy objects, you need to make sure that you have nitrile gloves, face mask, and the face mask that is recommended for use for dealing with mould is the FFP3 conforming to EN 149 plus A1. So the EN 149 plus A1, that's the European standard, and the FFP3, that's the design of the mask, how it's fitted, how it's shaped, and the filter pieces that are within it. If you want to have a look online, there's some really good National Health Service guidance on how to fit a face mask properly. Also, manufacturers who manufacture the face masks often have a little YouTube video just to make sure that it is properly fitted around your face and no gaps. Protection for your clothes, disposable overalls and overshoes. Tyvek overalls are very good for this, obviously. And also you may want to consider wearing goggles as well. Obviously, your protective equipment should be disposable. It should not be reused. So once you've finished dealing with your mould outbreak, you need to throw that away. At the end of your day or your shift, by sealing it in plastic bags, wash your hands after removing your gloves, wash your clothes when you get home. So think about the fact that the mould spores may actually have settled on you at some point, hopefully not, but they may be present, and so you will need to take those off. If you're going for a cup of tea, don't sit and have the cup of tea or your lunch in your Tyvek overalls, and it's a good idea not to leave your face mask face up in the room with the mould. Take that out of the room as well, so that mould spores aren't settling on the inside of your face mask while you're on your lunch break. Okay, so once the health and safety risks are understood and the correct procedures are in place, the good news is that the measures to prevent mould are pretty straightforward. So I'm going to look at these two in the final part of the talk. I don't know if you want to break for questions. I don't know if there are any questions, or whether you'd like me to carry on, Carolyn. I don't mind.
There is a question, so
Okay.
I shall read it out. So it gives you an opportunity to sip.
Thank you.
I'll read slowly. So here we go. So we recently had what we have assumed was two types of mold growing on a skirting board in a historic house.
Right.
One area was blue and smooth looking, and the other area right next to it was white and glistened, almost crystal-like. Neither had that telltale furry look of mold. RH was over 80, temperature around 10 Celsius. Was this likely to be mold or something else, given it wasn't furry?
I'm not sure about the crystalline look to that. I'm a bit reticent to comment without actually seeing the slide, without seeing an image of it. You're more than welcome to send one in. Crystalline sounds a little bit unusual, though. Is there some? It sounds a little bit like salts coming through. Was that on the top of the skirting board? Could it be salts efflorescing from the plaster behind and sitting on the top of the skirting board rather than coming through the wood?
I welcome Elaine, if you want to turn on your video.
Oh, sorry, Elaine. Okay, I'm loath to troubleshoot, Elaine, without actually seeing it. You're more than welcome to send some photographs. It can be quite flat. Mold growth can be quite flat, so it doesn't necessarily appear too furry, like the slide that we saw of the clog at the beginning, or the leather strap. So it can just be on the surface of it. But it sounds like your conditions are very conducive to having mould. So I would guess that. Would Elaine like to send a photo?
Yes. So she said she'll send some photos. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
And as I mentioned at the start of the session, we've got a relationship with Spencer and Fry to assist Southeast museums to identify PrevCon issues and so forth. So feel free to get in touch with us, and we can put you in touch with Philippa. There was another question, and this was, do you have any recommendations of where to buy FFP3 masks from, as we're struggling to find any at the moment?
That's a COVID related issue, I would have thought. So no, I don't, I'm afraid. I mean, they are readily available on the internet. So I'm sure I would just be doing the same search as you for them. I think if you're having difficulty getting them, it will be because of COVID. Providing you've done an internet, Googled them. There are a lot of companies that make them, but I suspect that will be the reason right now.
Okay, and if anyone has recently purchased these masks, if you want to share that in the chat, then at least we can get that information to the person who asked the question. Those are the only questions at the moment. So if you'd like to charge on. So just a reminder, if anyone does have questions, just feel free to put them in the chat at any point in the session.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, so we've just looked briefly at the health and safety risks and PPE. Good news is measures to prevent and remove mold growth, pretty straightforward. Less is more would be my advice for that. We'll have a look first of all about how to prevent mold growth. So we've looked at how mold operates and what it needs to survive and grow. So depriving mold of the environmental conditions that it needs to survive, we can obviously halt the progress of the outbreak and prevent further growth. We know that mould will grow in relative humidities of over 65%, so lowering the RH and therefore the moisture content of the air and the materials in the collection can help control mould growth. But firstly, we need to establish what's causing the high humidity or the damp environment that has resulted in the outbreak. And we can do this by environmental monitoring, obviously, to find out what's happening to cause the excessive humidity. Also a visual inspection of the building itself to establish where the water intrusion might be coming from. So is the building watertight? Are the high humidity levels attributable to a blocked drain, leaking roof, or leaky guttering, perhaps gappy windows, or perhaps proximity to areas of condensation, such as a cafe or museum reception area, people coming in with wet clothes. Perhaps objects are displayed or stored on cold floors or against a cold outside wall, or cold water pipes where microclimates of lower temperatures and higher relative humidities may have developed. So the source of the damp causing the problem should be dealt with at the outset to prevent further outbreaks. That needs dealing with first and foremost. The relative humidity of the space should therefore be brought down below 65% RH. It may be necessary to run a dehumidifier in areas where it's been discovered, and this should be done slowly and incrementally over a number of days or perhaps weeks if the RH has been continually high, in order not to reduce the moisture content of objects too quickly. So we don't want to be drying them out and causing damage such as shrinking and distortion, lifting of veneers and cracking of paint layers. So there's some good tips on the Spencer and Fry webinar on environmental monitoring. If you want to have a look at that about controlling your environment and methods to do that, that's worth a look. But basically you're trying to reduce the RH down to slow measured pace. Don't be tempted to introduce heat to dry out the area if the source of high humidity hasn't been dealt with, because obviously mould prefers temperature ranges that are warm, and a warm and damp environment will just exacerbate the problem and encourage further mould excuse me, mould outbreaks. We need to increase ventilation providing air circulation around the objects themselves in stores, making sure that they're not overpacked on shelves. There's some research being carried out by the National Trust at the moment, which is looking at bookshelves in libraries in historic buildings, and they are looking at whether it is better to increase ventilation around the bookshelves themselves by making holes in the bookshelves and having a gap at the back, or whether it's better to increase the ventilation in the room itself. So they're looking at microclimates versus climates in the room itself. So that's one to watch as well, because that might help with dealing with a holistic approach to a mould outbreak in your particular museum. Might be useful to introduce fans which set on cool. On dry days, periodically opening doors where possible, but obviously only once the mould has been removed from objects, otherwise you will be wafting mould around the place. So fans set on cool to improve the environment after mould has been removed. So we've dealt with the cause of the damp environment or the microclimate, established an environment in which mould won't grow. So it's important now to remove the residual mould on the objects themselves, so it doesn't have a chance to germinate and colonise other objects. So we don't want to reactivate it. So let's look at how to safely remove mould firstly from historic objects. Obviously, you've run through your health and safety considerations, borne in mind the cost regulations, carried out the risk assessment, gathered together your correct PPE. So where possible, isolate the affected object so that it cannot contaminate other objects in your collection. So you might want to wrap it in a sealed plastic bag or a tub to contain the spores while you're carrying it. But obviously don't leave it in the sealed plastic bag if the object is damp or the mould is still active. So take it to a dry, well-ventilated space where it can be assessed and cleaned. It's useful at this point to put up your hazard signage to let other colleagues know that there's a mouldy object within that room and notify them of that quarantine area. So once the mould is dry and therefore dormant, it can be removed by brush vacuuming. So check, because dry mould is powdery and not smeary, active mould smeary. So carry out a test first. Once dry, it can be brushed off with a hog's hair brush, pony hair brush, whatever brush you would use for your housekeeping on that object, you can use to remove the mould. But obviously keep your brushes separate once you have used them for mould. But in terms of the softness of the brush fibres, whatever you would normally use to clean the object will be the brush to use. The vacuum cleaner that you're brush vacuuming into should be fitted with a Hepa filter. This is the filter that is specific to dealing with mould, specified by the Health and Safety Executive, and this will trap the mould spores to make sure that they are not vented out of the back of the vacuum cleaner back into the room again. Any remaining mould can also be removed by wiping gently with a smoke sponge, cut to size. Some people use a chamois leather as well. You can cut these pieces up so that you can get into intricate areas. You might want to consider a cotton bud as well, just to gently wipe away any mould off the surface that has been left behind, not reached by the brush vacuuming. Obviously important to check the surface of the object is robust enough to withstand being brushed and wiped with the smoke sponge. So if the object has a fragile surface, then stop and get specialist advice from a conservator. Again, the simplest approach is best. It's advisable not to use any chemicals such as cleaning products or bleaches on historic objects because, of course, these can cause further damage. Alcohols have been used in the past to sterilise an object after mould outbreak, but new research is indicating that some types of alcohol can actually encourage more mould growth. So it's better not to use these, better not to use any chemicals at all. Just try and remove the dead mould with brush vacuuming and wiping off. We can be a little bit more robust, obviously, with non-historic surfaces, a more interventive approach. First and foremost, you need to dispose of any packing materials that the object has been in contact with. Make sure, obviously, that you've noted down any annotations or documentation that is written on the outside of the packing materials, but they should be disposed of in sealed plastic bags. And then you can clean down your shelves and storage surfaces. So these can be wiped down with a range of products. Virkon disinfectant, that's used in laboratories and hospitals, that's available on the internet, that can be used. Alcohol-free disinfectant wipes, Steri 7, seen there on the side, that's also available on the internet. And once you've used those, it's a good idea to wipe the shelves down with just plain water and then dry them as well, so that there aren't any chemicals that might come directly into contact with the objects when you put them back on the shelves. Hydrogen peroxide has been used in America. Some people think that it doesn't work. Other people have had some success with it, but it's unclear what percentage of solution should be used. So that is better avoided as well. Just the disinfectant products. Obviously, these items have health and safety and cost implications in themselves. So you will need to make sure that you have filled out a risk assessment and looked at the COSH literature for those disinfectant items as well. Again, you can build that into your risk assessment template. So that's good to go in the event of an emergency for your disaster preparedness. And also, should you have a separate independent mould outbreak, something to do in lockdown, perhaps, if you're not busy. And once the shelves are dry and the relative humidity in the store or the room in question has been established at the appropriate level, then obviously the objects can then be returned. It's important, obviously, to dispose of vacuum bags, mould-infested filters, contaminated smoke sponges and other waste by sealing them in thick plastic bags. Your brushes, again, good to mark those up for mould use only, and they can be cleaned in disinfectant and allowed to dry thoroughly. If you've got a lot of work to do, it might be worth getting some extra brushes so that you can have brushes drying and then dry brushes available for use the next day. So sort of one on, one in the wash type idea, but at least you're not delaying your cleanup operation waiting for your brushes to dry. So just to sum up, some aftercare notes. Prevention is better than cure. So ensure that the problem that is causing the high humidity level has been sorted out, and follow this up by introducing policies to prevent further outbreaks, including correct building maintenance programs and regular checkup routines of the building. So when you're locking up at night, is a good idea to check around the building, but on a regular basis as a routine. Monitoring and controlling the environment so that you have a better understanding of what's going on in the various spaces, what areas may be suitable to future outbreaks for effective management of those spaces. Get to know your building, get to know what might be some weak spots, what might be areas that might be prone to future mould attacks, so you're fully understanding where you might need to target checking and target your response. Think about how you can improve ventilation and air circulation as part of a routine. So perhaps you might be able to leave internal doors open or windows open if security is not an issue, just to ventilate the air as part of your aftercare routine. Keeping objects clean, as we've seen, mould likes dirt, so clean your objects and cover them if it's appropriate to cover them. Sometimes if you do have a humid environment, it's not necessarily a good idea to cover your objects. There's an argument about should you cover and trap objects in a microclimate, or should you expose them to dust. So that's a judgment call that you might want to make depending on the environment that you have discovered in your area, in your particular store. But obviously keeping the objects clean as part of your housekeeping routine will also help mitigate a mould outbreak. And obviously, finally, checking the objects regularly themselves for signs of future outbreaks. So that could be a visual check, or you might want to consider buying a UV light. You can get those online as well, some reasonably priced ones. Mould will fluoresce under UV light. So you could have a look at under UV light, or simply in raking light, which is just a normal torch, which you can shine on the side of the object to see if you can see a raised area where the furry mould is, spots on the surface. Obviously checking underneath, behind and inside your objects as well. So it's useful to build these simple measures into a regular routine, and they tie in well with your housekeeping programs, your insect pest management programs and your disaster preparedness programs. So you're not actually doubling up work. All these things tie in together. So if you can build those into a routine, then you're ticking off all your boxes in one, and you are then best set up to avoid a mould outbreak, and also you're then prepared to deal with one if one should occur. Okay, so I think that's me finished. I shall stop sharing the screen if that's all right. I daren't touch anything on this laptop.
I have another question.
How's that?
Yeah.
Cool.
So we do have another question that's popped up. What dehumidifiers would you recommend?
Ooh. I think that depends on personal requirements. I wouldn't recommend an industrial dehumidifier because they are a little bit too aggressive, probably for the museum space in question. There's obviously the two sorts, and they're both equally good, but they just have different running requirements. So you can have one that requires emptying, but you have to have staff on hand to be able to empty it if it's a store that people don't go to regularly. So that's a condensing dehumidifier. You can if you need to run it all the time, you can have one that is plumbed in so that it doesn't need to be regularly emptied. There's the reservoir of water that it's drawing out of the air. But then that means that you can't move that dehumidifier around if you wanted to locate it somewhere else that you needed on another occasion. Desiccant dehumidifiers are another option as well, but they have to be vented outside because there is a proportion of what they're venting is warm, damp air that they use to recondition the silica gel, which is basically what's inside them, is drawing your damp air across a silica gel drum and venting out the warm, damp air. So you don't want to be venting that back into your internal museum spaces. So those are the various considerations to think about. What is fit for your particular requirements. MECO, in terms of recommending a manufacturer, if that's what the question was, MECO, who make your environmental monitoring and control units, they do a dehumidifier that is fitted with a Hepa filter. Also Munters is another supplier that English Heritage use quite a lot for desiccant humidifiers. So I can put those two contact details in the notes if that's useful.
Definitely. We have another related question. So how gradually would you bring down RH with a dehumidifier?
That's That's a difficult one to answer, because this is why it's important that you have environmental monitoring records, so that you can see what the environment has been over a long period of time. So if an environment has been consistently high for a long period of time, you wouldn't want to be trying to dry your objects out over 48 hours. You would want to be drying them out over a number of weeks, slowly, incrementally moving down a few percentages each day, keeping an eye on the objects, regularly monitoring, making sure they're okay. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I think it would just be a matter of you looking at your environmental data and thinking in terms of 1 or 2% every couple of days, but I daren't be prescriptive about it without looking at your data.
Again, we can always arrange for Southeast Museums. If you contact the Museum Development Officer from my team for your region, we can always arrange for you to get some advice from Spencer and Fry.
Yeah, sorry not to be more precise, but it depends on your building as well. It depends who's using it. It depends what type of activity is going on and what time of day. So it would be better really to have a look at environmental data first before deciding how slowly you want to bring it down to 65, to below 65.
We have another question. So what are your thoughts about freezing an object, for example, textiles, before treatment?
Freezing is useful if you're responding to a disaster and you don't have time to clean things. You need to stop mould from developing because an object has got wet. But again, less is more. If you've just got one object and you can bring down the relative humidity to below 65, that is all you need to do. You wouldn't need to necessarily do anything as interventive as freezing the object.